Have you ever wondered how a forgotten people once challenged the greatest powers of the ancient world? From stone-walled capitals to thunder gods and iron blades, this story rises from the highlands of Anatolia. Before we begin, like and subscribe and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The Highland homeland, where the Hittites first rose. The story of the Hittites does not begin with kings or wars or treaties written in clay. It begins with land, with a vast interior plateau rising quietly between seas, shaped by wind, frost and time. This land is Anatolia, not the coastal edges where ships arrived and left, but the high interior where survival required patience and memory, and where people learned to live with uncertainty long before they learned to rule. Central Anatolia is not immediately dramatic. There are no great rivers that flood reliably each year, no lush jungles or endless forests. Instead, the ground rolls gently, rising and falling in long breaths of stone and soil. The horizon feels distant, the sky feels large. Winters arrive suddenly, often early, bringing snow that settles into valleys and clings to hillsides. Summers come dry and bright, the sun pressing hard against the earth, drawing moisture away until grass yellows and cracks appear in the soil. Rain is never guaranteed. Every season teaches restraint. For the people who lived here, the land itself was the first authority. It decided where villages could stand and how long they could endure. Water sources mattered more than beauty. A spring or shallow river could sustain life, but only if it was respected, guarded, and shared. Settlements clustered where the land allowed it, not where ambition desired it. Houses were built low and close together, often from mud brick reinforced with timber and stone, materials taken directly from the surrounding landscape. Nothing was wasted, because nothing was abundant. Encircling the plateau are mountains that quietly define it. To the north, the Pontic Range traps moisture from the Black Sea, feeding forests that feel distant and enclosed compared to the open interior. To the south, the Taurus Mountains rise sharply, creating a barrier between the plateau and the Mediterranean world. These mountains do more than block weather. They slow movement. They shape trade routes. They turn passes into points of control and valleys into corridors of influence. Anyone living in the highlands would grow up knowing that movement itself was power. Because of this geography, Anatolia was never isolated, but it was never fully open either. Ideas arrived slowly. People arrived in waves, not floods. Traders crossed the plateau carrying tin, copper, textiles, and stories, but they moved carefully, guided by seasons and terrain. The interior learned to watch rather than rush, to observe rather than expand. This habit would stay with the Hittites long after they became rulers. Long before the Hittite language was spoken here, before kings claimed descent from gods, this land was already inhabited by communities archaeologists would later call the people of Hatti. These were not an empire-building society. They were farmers, herders, craftspeople, and traders who understood the limits of their environment. Their towns were modest, but organised, often surrounded by low defensive walls, not built for glory, but for protection against raids and winter winds alike. Fields were small and carefully managed. Grain was planted with the knowledge that some years would fail. Herds were moved seasonally, guided by memory rather than maps. Storage pits mattered as much as houses. Survival depended not on expansion but on continuity. This created societies that valued order, precedent, and ritual. When things worked, they were preserved. When disasters came, they were remembered. The climate reinforced this mindset. A bad winter could starve a settlement. A dry spring could undo a year's planning. There was little room for reckless leadership. Decisions had consequences that lasted longer than a single season. Authority, when it emerged, had to be practical before it could be symbolic. Over time, these small towns became nodes in a wider network. Metals from the mountains, especially copper and silver, flowed through. Anatolia toward Mesopotamia, tin, rare and essential for bronze, passed through the plateau in controlled quantities. This made the interior valuable, not because it produced wealth easily, but because it connected worlds. Those who controlled the routes controlled influence. As centuries passed, new peoples arrived. Some came peacefully, settling among existing communities. Others arrived through pressure, conflict, or gradual dominance. Languages mixed. Gods were shared, renamed, absorbed. The land did not erase cultures, it layered them. This layering is crucial to understanding how the Hittites would later rule. They did not destroy what came before them, they incorporated it. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, certain towns in central Anatolia had grown more powerful than others. One of these was Hattusa. Its location was not accidental. Set among rocky hills with natural defensive advantages, it overlooked routes that linked the plateau to surrounding regions. Water was nearby, but not overly exposed. Stone was plentiful. Timber could be brought from the hills. It was a place that rewarded long-term planning rather than rapid growth. Life here remained demanding. Winters isolated communities. Snow closed passes. Communication slowed. This forced local leaders to develop administrative systems that could function even when contact was limited. Records mattered, agreements mattered, memory mattered. Oral tradition preserved law and lineage long before writing became widespread. When writing did arrive, carried through trade contacts with Mesopotamia, it was embraced not as ornament, but as a tool. Clay tablets recorded transactions, obligations, and treaties. This was not a land that celebrated excess, it celebrated clarity. The people who would become known as Hittites inherited all of this. They were shaped by a homeland that punished arrogance and rewarded patience. Their later laws, famously more restrained and compensatory than those of other ancient societies, echo the values of a land where survival depended on balance rather than domination. Even their gods reflect the landscape. Storm gods mattered here, not as abstract forces, but as very real arbiters of rain, fertility, and disaster. Mountains were sacred not because they were beautiful, but because they defined life itself. Sacred spaces were often open-air sanctuaries, carved into rock, acknowledging that the land was older than any city. When the Hittites eventually rose to power, they did not abandon their highland roots. They ruled an empire, but they ruled it like people who remembered hunger, isolation, and cold. Their capital remained inland. Their worldview remained grounded. To understand who the Hittites were, one must first understand where they came from. Not a river valley of easy abundance, not a coastal world of constant exchange, but a high, demanding plateau where survival was earned slowly, season by season, generation by generation. This land did not create conquerors overnight. It created planners, record keepers, diplomats, survivors. And long before the Hittites ruled empires, the Anatolian highlands taught them how to endure. Before empire, the people of Hatti and early Anatolia. Long before the Hittites ruled an empire, long before kings sealed treaties and chariots rolled across contested plains, the land already remembered its people. The interior of Anatolia had been lived in, worked, feared, respected, and understood for centuries before history ever gave it a famous name. What later generations would call the world of the Hittites was built upon something far older and far quieter, a deep foundation laid by the people of Hatti and the many early communities of Anatolia who came before empire, before ambition, before conquest. These early societies did not see themselves as the beginning of history. They were not trying to create something new. They were trying to survive something difficult. The Anatolian plateau demanded this humility. Winters were long and unforgiving, summers dry and uncertain, rainfall unpredictable. The land gave enough to live, but rarely enough to waste. This reality shaped every part of early Anatolian society, from how homes were built to how authority was understood. Settlements were placed carefully, not where the view was best, but where water could be trusted most often. Springs, shallow rivers, and seasonal streams determined where people stayed and where they moved on. Villages clustered together, houses sharing walls to preserve heat and materials. Mud brick was shaped from local soil, mixed with straw, dried in the sun, repaired again and again. Timber was valuable. Stone was used sparingly, mostly for foundations and ritual spaces. Nothing here was accidental. Life revolved around memory. People remembered which fields flooded after heavy snowmelt, which slopes held moisture longest into summer, which grazing routes stayed usable during harsh winters. Knowledge was inherited, not invented. Elders mattered because they remembered failure. Tradition mattered because it had been tested. Authority in these early societies was not loud. There is a little evidence for overwhelming palaces or absolute rulers in the earliest periods. Power seems to have rested in networks. Families, councils, ritual leaders, and community elders whose influence came from experience rather than force. In a land where survival depended on cooperation, authority that ignored the collective was dangerous. Religion grew naturally from this relationship with the land. Early Anatolian belief systems were deeply local. Gods were not distant cosmic figures removed from daily life. They were present in storms, mountains, springs, forests, and fields. A storm god mattered because storms destroyed crops or saved them. A mountain mattered because it shaped weather, movement, and memory. Sacred places were often outdoors. Rock formations, caves, groves, spaces where the boundary between human effort and natural power felt thin. Rituals were practical acts of continuity. Offerings were made not for abstract salvation, but for rain, protection, fertility, and balance. The same words were spoken in the same places year after year because change was risky. Stability was sacred. Death was treated with care and familiarity. Burial practices suggest that the dead remained part of the community. Graves contained personal items, tools, ornaments, pottery, not as displays of wealth alone, but as extensions of identity. Ancestors were remembered because they had survived the same hardships. Their endurance mattered. As centuries passed, Anatolia's position ensured contact with the outside world. Trade routes crossed the plateau, linking distant regions. Metals moved through these routes. Copper from Anatolian mountains, tin from farther east, finished goods from the south. Trade did not erase local culture, it layered onto it. One of the most significant changes came not through conquest, but commerce. Merchants from Mesopotamia arrived quietly, especially those connected to Assyrian trade networks. At places like Kanesh, traders settled among local populations. They rented homes, married locally, and conducted business within existing social frameworks. What they introduced was not domination, but writing. Clay tablets from Kanesh reveal a society already deeply familiar with rules, obligations, and accountability. These texts record loans, marriages, inheritance disputes, shipments, and contracts. Writing did not create order here. It preserved an order that already existed. The people of early Anatolia understood law as memory made permanent. These records show a culture that valued precedent. Agreements mattered beyond the moment. Reputation mattered across generations. Justice was less about punishment and more about restoration and balance. These ideas would later appear clearly in Hittite law, long before historians realised where they came from. Material culture evolved slowly, pottery styles changed gradually, tools improved incrementally, houses followed familiar patterns even as techniques advanced. This slow pace of change suggests a society confident enough to absorb influence without losing itself. Sites like Alakahoyuk reveal increasing social complexity. Rich tombs suggest elites existed, but even these elites were bound by tradition. Power was expressed symbolically, but not without restraint. Leadership existed to preserve order, not to overwhelm it. Violence was present, but limited. Defensive walls were practical, not monumental. Conflict likely took the form of raids, disputes, and localized struggles rather than organized expansion. Survival depended more on alliances than annihilation. Over generations, new peoples speaking Indo-European languages entered Anatolia gradually. There was no single invasion, no moment of collapse. These newcomers settled, intermarried, adopted local gods, learned local customs, and accepted existing traditions. Instead of replacing the people of Hatti, they merged with them. This blending explains a crucial fact. When the Hittite state later emerged, it did not erase the name of Hatti. It adopted it. The land remained Hatti. The gods remained Hattian. Rituals retained older languages even when rulers spoke new ones. Legitimacy came from continuity, not rupture. Even the structure of later Hittite society reflects this inheritance. Kings would rule, but they ruled as caretakers of an order older than themselves. Laws emphasized compensation over vengeance. Treaties emphasized balance over domination. Diplomacy mattered because Anatolia had always been a place where survival depended on negotiation. Before empire, there was already administration. Before kings, there were councils. Before conquest, there were contracts. The people of Hatti and early Anatolia created a social world that valued memory, balance, restraint, and responsibility. The Hittites did not rise from nothing. They rose from a land already shaped by centuries of careful living. Empire would come later. Power would expand. History would finally take notice. But beneath it all remained the quiet, unbroken foundation of early Anatolia. Before empire, there was Hatti, and Hatti never truly vanished. It endured, shaping everything that followed. The birth of the Hittite kingdom. The birth of the Hittite kingdom was not a single moment, not a sudden declaration of empire, or a dramatic conquest that reshaped the world overnight. It was a slow gathering of authority, memory, and legitimacy, rising quietly out of the layered societies of Anatolia. The Hittites did not invent kingship here. They inherited it, reshaped it, and anchored it to a city that would become both a political centre and a symbol of endurance, Hattusa. For centuries before the Hittite kingdom existed, Anatolia had known rulers. Local kings governed towns and surrounding lands, balancing ritual authority with practical leadership. These early rulers were not emperors. Their power was limited by geography, tradition, and the collective memory of their people. A king who failed to protect harvests, maintain alliances, or respect ancestral customs could be replaced as easily as he was elevated. Authority was conditional. What changed in the early second millennium BCE was not the existence of kings, but the scale of their ambition and the permanence of their institutions. Gradually, certain rulers began to extend their influence beyond a single city or valley. They did so not through constant warfare, but through careful unification, absorbing smaller polities, negotiating alliances, and presenting themselves as guardians of an order older than any individual ruler. This process unfolded in a land already accustomed to negotiation. Trade networks had taught Anatolia how to manage obligation and trust. Religious traditions had taught people how to accept layered authority, where old gods could coexist with new names. Law had already taught communities how to resolve conflict without destroying themselves. The early Hittite kings stepped into this world rather than tearing it apart. Hattusa itself did not begin as an obvious capital. It was not the richest city, nor the most fertile. It sat among rocky hills, exposed to cold winds and harsh winters. But its strength lay in position and memory. Natural defences surrounded it. Steep slopes, narrow approaches, and access to water made it difficult to attack and easy to defend. More importantly, it sat near routes that connected the Anatolian plateau to surrounding regions. Whoever held Hattusa could watch movement across the land. Before it became the heart of a kingdom, Hattusa had already known destruction. Earlier rulers had burned it, cursed it, and abandoned it. This history mattered. When later kings chose to rebuild and rule from Hattusa, they were making a statement, not of convenience, but of defiance and continuity. To rule from a city that had been destroyed and reborn was to declare mastery over memory itself. The earliest Hittite rulers understood that power required legitimacy as much as force. They presented themselves not simply as conquerors, but as restorers. They spoke the language of tradition. They honoured the gods of Hatti. They upheld existing laws and customs, even as they expanded their reach. In doing so, they reassured newly absorbed communities that unification did not mean erasure. Kingship during this period was deeply personal. The king was not a distant figure hidden behind palace walls. He was expected to lead armies, preside over rituals, judge disputes, and maintain relationships with both gods and people. Failure in any of these roles weakened authority. Success strengthened it. One of the defining features of early Hittite kingship was its emphasis on law and responsibility. Unlike some neighbouring societies that celebrated absolute rule, the Hittites preserved traditions in which kings could be criticised, corrected, or even overthrown if they violated accepted norms. This restraint was not weakness, it was stability. As the kingdom began to take shape, military action did increase, but it was strategic rather than reckless. Campaigns were seasonal, limited by climate and logistics. The goal was not annihilation, but control. Cities were subdued, not destroyed. Their elites were integrated. Their gods were respected. Their people were taxed, not displaced. This method of expansion created something new in Anatolia, a kingdom that could grow without constant collapse. Authority radiated outward from the king, but it rested on a foundation of local administration. Governors, officials, and scribes maintained order. Records were kept. Obligations were tracked. Memory became institutional. Hattusa transformed alongside this political growth. Walls rose, not as symbols of intimidation, but as practical defences shaped to the terrain. Gates were carved with lions and protective figures, not merely to impress visitors, but to declare sacred protection. Temples multiplied, honouring both ancient local gods and newly elevated deities tied to royal power. The city became a living archive. Treaties were stored, ritual texts were preserved, historical records were copied and recopied. The past was not forgotten, it was curated. This obsession with memory was not accidental, it reinforced legitimacy. A king who could claim continuity with earlier rulers, gods and traditions was harder to challenge. Unification was not smooth. Succession disputes, rival claimants, and internal rebellions marked the early kingdom. Brothers turned against brothers. Sons challenged fathers. These conflicts were not signs of failure, but evidence of a system struggling to define itself. Out of these struggles emerged clearer rules of succession, clearer limits on authority, and clearer definitions of loyalty. One of the most remarkable aspects of early Hittite state formation was its ability to survive internal tension without fragmenting entirely. Even during periods of instability, the idea of the kingdom endured. The land remained Hatti, the gods remained present, the capital endured. By the time the Hittite kingdom fully emerged, it was no longer just a collection of allied cities. It was a political identity. To belong to it meant accepting a shared legal framework, a shared religious world, and a shared memory of kings who ruled not as gods, but as custodians of balance. Hattusa stood at the centre of this identity, not as a city of luxury, but as a city of record, ritual, and resolve. Its stones absorbed generations of footsteps. Its archives held the weight of centuries. Its walls marked not just boundaries, but intention. The birth of the Hittite kingdom was not loud. It did not announce itself with monuments meant to awe the world. It emerged slowly, through administration, compromise, and endurance. It was shaped by a land that demanded patience, and by people who understood that survival depended on continuity. Empire would come later. Great wars would follow. The name of the Hittites would one day reach Egypt and beyond. But all of that rested on this quiet beginning, on early kings who unified without erasing, on a capital that embodied resilience, and on a kingdom born not from ambition alone, but from memory carefully preserved. This was the true beginning of the Hittites. Hattusa, capital of stone, walls, and gods. Hattusa was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to endure. Long before it became the unquestioned heart of a rising kingdom, the city that would be known as Hattusa sat high among broken hills in central Anatolia, exposed to wind, winter, and silence. The land around it was harsh, the soil thin, the seasons unforgiving. Yet this was precisely why it mattered. Hattusa was not chosen for comfort. It was chosen for control, memory, and survival. To approach Hattusa was to feel the land tighten around you, the hills narrow movement, valleys funnel travellers along predictable routes. From above, the city commands its surroundings not through height alone, but through awareness. Nothing arrives unnoticed, nothing leaves unseen. In a land where movement meant power, this mattered more than abundance. The city grew not as a single burst of construction, but as a layered accumulation. Earlier settlements lay beneath later ones, each generation building atop the remains of the last. This vertical memory gave Hattusa weight. The stones themselves became witnesses. Destruction did not erase the city, it reshaped it. Fires burned, walls fell, rebuilding followed. Each time, the city returned stronger, more deliberate. Urban planning in Hattusa was not based on symmetry or display. It followed the land. Streets curved with the hills. Districts rose and fell with the terrain. What might appear chaotic to a distant observer made perfect sense to those who lived there. Defense came first. Movement came second. Beauty came last. The walls of Hattusa were its most defining feature. They did not form a simple ring. They followed ridgelines, wrapped around high ground, and sealed natural gaps. Towers rose at intervals, not evenly spaced, but placed where attack was most likely. Gates were few, heavily fortified, and symbolically guarded. The Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate, these were not decorations. They were warnings carved into stone. Passing through a gate at Hattusa was an experience meant to impress upon the visitor that they were entering a protected, watched and sacred space. Stone lions stared outward, their presence both physical and spiritual. They were guardians against enemies and against disorder itself. In Hittite thought, chaos was not merely external, it was a force that could seep in through carelessness. The walls existed to keep more than armies out. Inside the city, space was divided by function rather than class alone. Administrative buildings clustered where scribes could work undisturbed. Storage facilities were placed strategically, protected from fire and theft. Grain, oil, and supplies were guarded as fiercely as any gate. In a land where famine was always possible, storage was power. Temples were everywhere, but none dominated the city in isolation. Hattusa was not ruled by a single god, it was ruled by many. The Hittites famously spoke of 1,000 gods, and nowhere was this more visible than in their capital. Each district honoured different deities, often inherited from older Hattian traditions, or absorbed from conquered lands. This was not religious confusion, it was political strategy. By honouring local gods within the capital, the Hittite kings made a statement. All gods had a place here, all traditions were acknowledged. Loyalty to the king did not require abandonment of identity, it required inclusion. Hattusa became a sacred map of the empire itself. Royal power did not announce itself through towering palaces meant to dwarf the population. Instead, the royal complex blended into the city's fabric. The king was present, but not distant. He ruled through ritual, law, and memory as much as force. His authority was reinforced daily through ceremonies, legal judgments, and offerings that reminded the population that order was maintained deliberately, not assumed. The archives of Hattusa were its true heart. Thousands of clay tablets filled rooms stacked carefully, recording treaties, laws, rituals, omens, correspondence, and history. The Hittites wrote obsessively. They copied texts again and again, preserving older traditions even when they no longer fully understood the language. Memory mattered more than clarity. What had been important once might be important again. These archives reveal a city obsessed with continuity. Treaties with foreign powers were stored alongside ritual texts and royal edicts. The past was not separated from the present. It was consulted constantly. Kings justified decisions by citing precedent. Gods were appeased using rituals preserved from generations earlier. Forgetting was dangerous. Beyond the walls of the city proper lay sacred landscapes that extended Hattusa's authority into the surrounding hills. One of the most important of these was Yazilikaya. Carved directly into living rock, this open-air sanctuary depicted a procession of gods, kings, and cosmic order. Itself, here, stone became theology. The natural world and the divine world merged. Yazilikaya was not separate from the city, it completed it. Where walls defined physical order, Yazilikaya defined cosmic order. Together, they reinforced the idea that Hattusa was not just a political capital, but the centre of a balanced universe. Daily life within Hattusa followed rhythms shaped by both administration and ritual. Scribes copied texts, officials settled disputes, artisans produced tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. Farmers moved between city and countryside depending on season. The population shifted constantly, swelling during festivals and contracting during winter. Despite its importance, Hattusa was never overcrowded. Space was managed carefully. Fire was a constant threat, and building density reflected this fear. Separation between districts was intentional. Roads doubled as fire breaks. Wells were placed strategically. Even disaster was planned for. Royal power was reinforced not through terror, but through presence. The king appeared in public rituals. He presided over festivals. He served as chief intermediary between gods and people. Failure in ritual was as dangerous as failure in battle. A king who offended the gods risked famine, plague, or defeat. The city itself participated in these rituals. Processions moved along specific routes. Gates were opened and closed according to sacred calendars. Temples echoed with repeated words spoken exactly as they had been for generations. Change was slow. Innovation was cautious. Hattusa was also a city of silence. Winters were brutal. Snow cut off routes, communication slowed, the capital became inward looking, its population relying on stored supplies and internal order. These months tested administration. A city that could not function in isolation would not survive. Hattusa did. Foreign visitors experienced Hattusa differently. Diplomats from distant lands walked its gates, aware they were entering a city that did not resemble the river capitals of the south. There were no lush gardens fed by predictable floods. There was no easy abundance. Instead, there was discipline, structure, restraint. This impressed allies and unsettled enemies. The walls, the gods, the archives, the rituals, all reinforced the same message. Power here was not impulsive, it was deliberate, it was preserved, it remembered. When the Hittite Empire reached its height, Hattusa remained its anchor. Even as territories expanded and armies marched far from the plateau, the capital stayed where it had always been, high, cold, and watchful. Kings returned here to be legitimized. Treaties returned here to be stored. Gods returned here to be honored. And when the empire finally collapsed, it was Hattusa that burned. The city fell not because its walls failed, but because the world around it changed faster than memory could adapt. Trade routes broke, climate shifted, systems that depended on balance lost it. When Hattusa was abandoned, it was not forgotten immediately. It lingered in stories, in ruins, in the stubborn persistence of stone. Today, the ruins still rise from the hills, quiet and incomplete. Walls trace the land, gates stare outward. Temples lie open to the sky. The city no longer speaks, but it does not need to. Hattusa was never built to impress eternity. It was built to hold the world together, one season at a time. Kings, queens, and the laws that ruled an empire. Power in the Hittite world did not rest on spectacle alone. It rested on memory, restraint, and an unusual belief for the ancient world. That authority could be strong without being absolute. To understand how the Hittites ruled an empire, one must move away from the image of god-kings issuing commands from unreachable palaces, and instead step into a system where kings answered to law, queens shaped diplomacy, and justice was meant to restore balance rather than inspire fear. The Hittite king was powerful, but he was never untouchable. From the earliest days of the kingdom, rulership in Hatti was understood as a duty rather than a divine right. The king ruled by tradition, by precedent, and by the consent of an order far older than himself. He was not a god on earth. He was the chief servant of the gods, the guardian of law, and the keeper of continuity. This idea shaped everything. The king was expected to lead armies, judge disputes, conduct rituals, and preserve harmony between humans and gods. Failure in any of these roles weakened his legitimacy. A military defeat could be forgiven if ritual obligations were fulfilled. A ritual failure, however, could end a reign regardless of military success. Order mattered more than glory. Succession itself was carefully negotiated. Unlike many neighbouring kingdoms where violence defined royal inheritance, the Hittites attempted to regulate succession through formal agreements and proclamations. This did not prevent conflict entirely. Brothers still fought, sons still challenged fathers, but it created a framework where legitimacy mattered as much as force. A king who seized power without justification risked rebellion, curses, and loss of divine favour. Royal authority was also collective. The king did not rule alone. Councils of nobles, elders, military leaders, and high officials advised, challenged, and sometimes constrained him. These councils were not symbolic. They held real influence, especially during times of crisis. Decisions of war, treaties, and succession were often framed as collective acts rather than personal decrees. This collective governance extended to law. Hittite law codes reveal a society deeply concerned with proportion, responsibility, and repair. Unlike many ancient legal systems that favoured brutal punishments, Hittite law often emphasised compensation. Injury required restitution. Theft required repayment. Even serious crimes were frequently resolved through fines rather than death. This does not mean the Hittites were gentle. Capital punishment existed. So did corporal punishment and enslavement. But the guiding principle was balance. Justice was meant to restore social harmony, not simply eliminate offenders. This reflects a society shaped by scarcity, where removing productive members was costly and dangerous. Law was not static. Kings revised, clarified, and reaffirmed legal traditions over time. New rulings were layered onto old ones rather than replacing them. Earlier customs, especially those inherited from the people of Hatti, were preserved even when their original context had faded. Memory mattered. Precedent mattered. Writing played a central role in this system. Laws were recorded on clay tablets, copied and recopied, stored and consulted. A law once written did not disappear easily. This permanence restrained royal authority. A king could interpret law, but he could not easily erase it. In this way, writing became a quiet check on power. The king's role as judge was deeply symbolic. He represented the final appeal, the living embodiment of justice, but he was expected to judge according to law, not whim. A ruler who ignored established norms risked unrest, divine displeasure, and eventual removal. Kings were remembered not only for victories, but for fairness. Queens played a role just as significant, though often overlooked in later histories. Hittite queens were not. Passive figures. They held property, issued decrees, led rituals, and conducted diplomacy. Some queens ruled alongside kings as equals in all but title. Their authority did not vanish upon the king's death. In some cases, queens retained power, influence, and status for decades. The queen's role was especially important in religion. She often served as high priestess, maintaining continuity of ritual regardless of political upheaval. When kings died or were overthrown, queens ensured that the gods remained honoured and the state remained ritually intact. This stability was critical in a culture that feared divine disorder as much as political chaos. Marriage itself was a tool of governance. Royal marriages linked families, secured alliances, and legitimised rule. Queens brought not only prestige, but networks of loyalty and obligation. Through them, the empire extended its influence quietly, without armies. Law and governance extended beyond the capital. Local officials administered justice in towns and provinces, guided by central authority but sensitive to local customs. This flexibility allowed the Hittite Empire to govern diverse populations without constant rebellion. Local traditions were respected as long as loyalty and tribute were maintained. Treaties reflected this same philosophy. Hittite treaties were detailed, reciprocal, and carefully preserved. They outlined obligations on both sides, invoked gods as witnesses, and included consequences for violation. These agreements were not symbolic. They were binding contracts enforced by law, ritual, and memory. The king's power rested not on terror, but on reliability. Subjects needed to believe that the system worked, that disputes would be resolved, rituals maintained, and order preserved. When this belief weakened, authority weakened with it. Even rebellion was framed within this system. Rebels were condemned not merely as enemies, but as breakers of order. Punishment was justified as restoration, not vengeance. The language of law permeated every act of power. Over time, this system created something rare in the ancient world, an empire held together by rules as much as force. The Hittites understood that conquest was easy compared to governance. Their answer was law, memory, and shared responsibility. Kings came and went, dynasties rose and faltered, but the system endured because it was never about a single ruler. It was about balance between king and council, law and tradition, gods and people. When the Hittite Empire finally collapsed, it was not because its laws failed. It was because the world around it changed faster than any system could adapt. Trade routes broke, climate shifted, alliances dissolved, the carefully maintained balance fractured, yet the legacy remained. Later civilizations would rediscover Hittite laws and marvel at their restraint. Diplomats would study their treaties as early examples of international law. Historians would note how queens ruled beside kings and how authority could exist without absolute tyranny. The Hittites ruled not by fear alone, but by structure, not by divine arrogance, but by inherited responsibility. Their empire was governed not just by kings, but by law, and that law remembered the land that shaped it. Chariots, iron, and the Hittite art of war. War, for the Hittites, was never just a matter of strength. It was a discipline shaped by land, scarcity, memory, and restraint. Long before their armies faced Egypt or marched beyond the Anatolian plateau, the people who would become the Hittites learned that survival depended not on reckless aggression, but on preparation, timing, and adaptability. Their art of war was born from the same harsh environment that shaped their laws and cities, and it evolved into one of the most influential military systems of the late Bronze Age. The land itself was the first teacher. Central Anatolia offered no wide floodplains for endless manoeuvring, no predictable seasons for constant campaigning. Winters were brutal, cutting off movement and supply. Summers were dry, limiting forage for animals and men alike. Any army that marched without planning risked starvation before battle ever began. As a result, Hittite warfare was seasonal, deliberate, and cautious. Campaigns were launched when the land allowed it, not when ambition demanded it. Early conflict in Anatolia was small in scale. Raids, border disputes, and local struggles over land and water shaped early military culture. These encounters emphasized defense as much as offense. Towns were fortified, passes were watched, intelligence mattered. Knowing when an enemy might move was often more important than how many soldiers could be raised. This emphasis on awareness would remain central to Hittite military thinking even as their power expanded. As the Hittite kingdom began to form, warfare shifted from local survival to political unification. Kings led campaigns not to annihilate rivals, but to absorb them. Cities were taken intact whenever possible. Their elites were preserved, their gods respected, their populations taxed rather than displaced. War was a tool of governance, not destruction. Victory was measured in stability, not ruin. Central to this transformation was the chariot. While chariots were known throughout the ancient Near East, the Hittites adapted them to suit their own needs and terrain. Their chariots were heavier and sturdier than those used by many rivals, designed to carry 3 men rather than 2. One drove, one wielded weapons, and one provided protection. This made the Hittite chariot less agile, but far more versatile and deadly in direct confrontation. The Hittite chariot was not a platform for archery alone. It was a mobile unit of shock and command. Chariots carried officers, messengers, and elite warriors. They broke enemy lines, pursued fleeing troops, and coordinated infantry movements. On the battlefield, they served as both weapon and signal, directing the flow of combat through presence as much as force. Training mattered. Chariot warfare required coordination between horses, driver, and warriors. Horses were valuable assets, carefully bred, trained, and protected. Manuals on horse training survived in Hittite archives, revealing a scientific approach to warfare that emphasized conditioning, diet, and discipline. War was treated as a craft, not a gamble. Infantry formed the backbone of the Hittite army. Armed with spears, shields, and later swords, these soldiers were not merely expendable masses. They were organised, supplied, and supported. Hittite commanders understood that infantry held ground while chariots exploited opportunity. One without the other was ineffective. Metal played a decisive role. Bronze remained the primary material for weapons, but Anatolia's access to metal resources gave the Hittites an advantage. They controlled important trade routes for copper and tin, allowing them to equip armies reliably. More importantly, they experimented early with iron. While iron weapons were rare and initially symbolic, the knowledge of ironworking gave the Hittites prestige and technological confidence. Iron was not yet superior to bronze in quality, but it represented the future, and the Hittites understood that. Armour and shields reflected practical design rather than ornamentation. Protection needed to function in close combat and harsh climates. Helmets, scale armour, and reinforced shields appear in reliefs and texts. Soldiers were expected to endure prolonged engagements rather than quick, decisive clashes. This endurance mirrored the Hittite worldview itself. Logistics were as important as weapons. Campaigns were planned with supply lines in mind. Grain, animals, and equipment were gathered in advance. Roads and passes were secured. Fortified outposts supported movement across hostile territory. The Hittites understood that an army defeated by hunger was defeated more completely than one beaten in battle. Command structure reflected the broader Hittite approach to authority. The king often led armies personally, but he was supported by generals, advisors, and officials. Decisions were debated, intelligence was gathered, omens were consulted. War was never purely secular. The gods were always involved. Before battle, rituals were performed to secure divine favour. Storm gods were invoked for strength and confusion of enemies. Oaths were sworn, sacrifices were made. Victory was believed to depend as much on ritual correctness as on strategy. A campaign launched without proper observance risked disaster regardless of military strength. One of the defining moments of Hittite military history was their confrontation with ancient Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh. This clash did not produce the decisive victory claimed by either side, but it revealed the Hittite approach to warfare clearly. They relied on intelligence, surprise, and coordinated chariot action to challenge one of the most powerful armies of the age. The battle ended without annihilation, but with negotiation, an outcome entirely consistent with Hittite strategy. For the Hittites, war did not end when fighting stopped. Treaties followed battles as naturally as weapons preceded them. Agreements formalized outcomes, defined borders, and transformed enemies into allies. The battlefield was only one phase of conflict. Diplomacy was the continuation of war by other means. Even rebellion within the empire was treated through this lens. Force was applied to restore order, not to destroy populations. Punishment was calculated. Cities were disciplined, not erased. Stability mattered more than vengeance. Over time, the Hittite military system became one of deterrence as much as conquest. Their reputation for discipline, organisation, and resilience discouraged many potential challenges. Power did not always need to be demonstrated. Sometimes it only needed to be remembered. Yet this system was fragile. It depended on balance between resources and expansion, ritual and innovation, force and diplomacy. When the late Bronze Age world began to destabilise, these balances collapsed. Trade routes broke, supplies dwindled, allies faltered. Even the most disciplined army could not fight hunger, climate, and systemic collapse forever. When the Hittite Empire fell, it was not because their art of war had failed, it was because the world that sustained it disappeared. The chariots stood ready, the weapons remained sharp, but the networks that fed and supported them were gone. Still, the legacy endured. Later civilizations remembered the Hittites as masters of warfare, not because they conquered endlessly, but because they understood its limits. They knew when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to endure. Their armies were not built for spectacle, they were built for survival. And in that, the Hittites revealed a deeper truth about war itself, that the greatest strength lies not in destruction but in control. Gods of sky, storm and earth. Religion for the Hittites was not a separate sphere of life. It was the structure that held everything else in place. Law, war, kingship, agriculture, diplomacy, and even memory itself were bound to the gods. To live in the Hittite world was to exist inside a sacred system where every action echoed beyond the human realm, and where disorder, cosmic as much as social, was the greatest threat imaginable. The Hittites inherited a religious world that was already ancient when they arrived. The land of Hatti was filled with gods long before Hittite kings ruled it. Mountains had names and wills. Storms were personalities, not phenomena. Rivers remembered oaths. Forests concealed presences older than cities. The Hittites did not replace this world. They absorbed it. This is why Hittite religion appears vast, layered, and sometimes overwhelming. They spoke of 1,000 gods, not as poetry, but as administration. Every city had its deities. Every region had its sacred forces. Conquered lands brought their gods with them, and these gods were not exiled or erased. They were welcomed, recorded, fed, and honoured. To neglect a god was to invite catastrophe. At the centre of this divine multitude stood the gods of sky and storm. In the Anatolian highlands, weather was destiny. Rain could mean survival, a storm could mean ruin. The storm god, often known as Tarhuna, was therefore not merely powerful, he was essential. He controlled rain, thunder, fertility, victory and legitimacy. Kings ruled in his name, armies marched under his protection, treaties were sworn before him, but even the storm god was not alone. He existed within a family, a court, a network of divine relationships that mirrored human society. There were gods of earth and underworld, gods of sun and justice, gods of plague and healing, gods of borders and thresholds. Each had a role, each had rituals that had to be performed correctly, repeatedly, without error. Ritual. Correctness mattered more than belief. The Hittites did not ask whether one believed in the gods. The gods were assumed. What mattered was whether one honoured them properly. A failed ritual could bring drought, defeat, or disease. A forgotten offering could doom a city. Precision was sacred. This is why Hittite ritual texts are so detailed. Thousands of clay tablets preserved exact words, gestures, sequences, and materials required for ceremonies. Some rituals were copied in languages no longer spoken, preserved purely because tradition demanded it. The meaning might be unclear, but the form was inviolable. Memory itself was an offering. Kings and queens stood at the centre of this ritual world. The king was not divine, but he was indispensable. He served as chief priest, mediator between gods and people. His body mattered, his purity mattered. His actions could bless or endanger the entire land. When disaster struck, plague, famine, defeat, the king was expected to investigate which god had been offended and how balance could be restored. Queens held equal religious weight. Often serving as high priestesses, they ensured continuity when kings died or were absent. Ritual authority did not disappear with political instability. This stability was crucial. The gods did not care about succession disputes. They demanded consistency. Temples filled the capital and extended far beyond it. In Hattusa, sacred buildings stood alongside administrative ones, woven into the daily movement of the city. Offerings were made daily. Festivals followed agricultural cycles. Processions moved through streets, transforming urban space into sacred theatre. The city itself became a ritual instrument. Beyond the walls lay sacred landscapes that completed the religious world. One of the most important was Yazilikaya. Here, gods were carved directly into living rock, arranged in procession, facing one another across stone chambers open to the sky. This was not decoration, it was cosmology made visible. The universe was ordered. The gods marched in harmony. The kings stood among them, not as an equal, but as a necessary link. Yazilikaya reveals something essential about Hittite religion. The natural world was not separate from the divine world. Stone, sky, and earth were sacred by nature. Temples enhanced this sacredness, but they did not create it. The gods were already there. Festivals were moments when this divine order was renewed. During these times, gods were believed to travel, feast, and interact with one another. Statues were moved, food was prepared, songs were sung. The community participated collectively in maintaining cosmic balance. These festivals were not optional. They were necessary acts of survival. Divination played a central role in decision-making. Before war, treaties, or major building projects, omens were consulted. The movement of birds, the behaviour of animals, dreams, and ritual signs were interpreted carefully. The future was not random. It was readable if one knew how to look. When things went wrong, blame was not assigned blindly. Investigations were conducted. Ritual inquiries sought to identify which god had been angered and why. This process could involve consulting ancient texts, reenacting forgotten rituals, or importing priests from distant regions. No effort was spared. To fail to seek the cause was itself an offence. Foreign gods were treated with remarkable respect. When the Hittites conquered a city, its gods were brought to Atusa, housed, fed, and honoured. This was not tolerance, it was necessity. A god deprived of worship could become hostile. Better to keep them close, where they could be appeased. Treaties invoked gods as witnesses. These were not symbolic gestures. Gods enforced agreements. Breaking a treaty was not just political betrayal, it was cosmic crime. Curses listed in treaties were vivid and terrifying, calling upon gods to destroy harvests, families, and memory itself. Law and religion were inseparable. Even illness and misfortune were framed within this system. Plagues were divine messages. Healing required ritual correction as much as medicine. Confession texts reveal kings admitting mistakes not only to gods, but to history itself, recording failure so it would not be repeated. What emerges from this religious world is not superstition, but responsibility. The Hittites believed that order had to be actively maintained. Chaos was always near. The gods were powerful, but not automatically benevolent. They required attention, care, and respect. This worldview created a society obsessed with memory. Rituals were copied, myths were preserved. Even foreign stories were translated and stored. Forgetting was dangerous, remembering was sacred. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, the gods did not vanish overnight. Rituals continued in successor states. Storm gods were renamed, not abandoned. Sacred landscapes remained holy long after kings disappeared. The religious system outlived the empire that had organized it. The Hittites ruled many lands, but they were ruled by their gods, not through fear alone, but through obligation. In a world balanced between sky, storm, and earth, survival depended on remembering one truth above all others. The universe was alive, watching, and never indifferent. Life inside the empire. Farmers, scribes, and traders. Life inside the Hittite Empire was not defined by palaces or battlefields, even though history often remembers only those. It was defined by repetition, by seasons returning whether kings lived or died, by hands working soil, clay, wool, and metal, by voices reciting contracts, prayers, and measurements. The empire existed because ordinary life functioned, quietly, persistently, and with remarkable discipline across the highlands of Anatolia. Most people in the Hittite world never saw the inside of a royal archive or the pageantry of a great festival. They lived in villages, farmsteads, and small towns scattered across valleys and plateaus. Their days began before sunrise, shaped by weather and obligation rather than decree. The land decided the rhythm of life more than the king ever could. Farming was the foundation of everything. Grain fields stretched across narrow valleys and open plains wherever soil allowed. Wheat and barley were the staples, planted with care, harvested with anxiety. Rain was never guaranteed. A good year meant survival. A bad year meant hunger. There was little margin for error. Farmers learned to read the sky, the soil, the wind. Knowledge was passed down with the seriousness of law. Fields were not owned casually. Land belonged to households, temples, or the crown, and obligations were attached to it. Taxes were paid not in coin, but in grain, livestock, labour, and service. A farmer owed part of his harvest to sustain officials, soldiers, and priests. This was not exploitation alone, it was survival of the system. Storage facilities across the empire held reserves meant to carry the population through winter and drought. When these failed, disaster followed. Livestock mattered as much as crops. Sheep and goats grazed on marginal land where grain could not grow. Wool was one of the empire's most valuable resources, spun and woven by households and workshops. Cattle provided traction, meat, hides, and status. Herding required movement, memory, and negotiation. Grazing routes crossed administrative boundaries, demanding cooperation and oversight. Villages were tightly organised, houses were practical, built from mud brick with stone foundations, often sharing walls to conserve heat. Interiors were dark, smoky, and functional. Hearths were central. Storage jars lined walls. Tools were kept close. Space was not wasted. Life was lived largely outdoors when weather allowed, indoors when it did not. Social structure was layered but flexible. At the base were farmers, herders, labourers, and craftspeople. Above them stood local officials, landholders, and administrators. At the top were royal officials, priests, and military leaders. Slavery existed, but it was not the defining feature of the economy. Many enslaved people worked within households or temples and could sometimes earn freedom. Status was not entirely fixed. Service to the state could elevate a family. Failure could ruin one. Craft production filled towns and cities. Potters shaped vessels for storage, transport, and ritual. Metalworkers produced tools, weapons, and fittings essential to daily life and defence. Carpenters, masons, and leatherworkers supported both civilian and military needs. These crafts were not romantic trades. They were regulated, taxed, and recorded. Output mattered. Quality mattered. This is where scribes entered the picture. Writing was the nervous system of the empire. Scribes recorded harvests, deliveries, labour obligations, court cases, treaties, and rituals. They worked in administrative centres, temples, and cities like Hattusa, but their influence extended far beyond city walls. A tablet written in a provincial town could affect decisions made at the heart of the empire. Scribes were trained specialists. They learned multiple languages and scripts, copying texts endlessly until precision became instinct. Errors were dangerous. A miswritten contract could cause dispute. A miscopied ritual could anger the gods. Literacy was power, but it was also responsibility. Scribes were respected, watched, and indispensable. Trade connected the empire internally and externally. Markets existed in towns and cities, exchanging grain, wool, metal goods, pottery, and livestock. Long-distance trade linked Anatolia to Mesopotamia, the Levant, and beyond. One of the most important early trade centres was Kanesh, where generations earlier merchants had laid the groundwork for Anatolia's commercial culture. That tradition never disappeared. Merchants travelled carefully, guided by seasons and security. Roads followed valleys and passes. Inns and way stations supported movement. Trade was regulated, taxed, and protected by law. Contracts outlined responsibilities, risks, and profits. Disputes were settled through courts rather than violence whenever possible. Trust was a commodity as valuable as metal. Women played visible roles in economic life. They managed households, produced textiles, owned property, and participated in contracts. In some cases, women acted as merchants, lenders, and administrators. Their labour sustained families and institutions alike. The economy depended on them, even if later histories minimised their presence. Religion intersected with daily life constantly. Temples were economic centres as much as sacred ones. They owned land, employed workers, stored surplus, and distributed resources. Festivals disrupt normal routines, but they also redistributed food and reinforced community bonds. Participation was not optional. Ritual was labour, and labour was sacred. Justice reached into daily affairs. Disputes over land, livestock, injury, and debt were common. Courts sought resolution through compensation rather than destruction. The goal was to restore balance, not to remove people from society unnecessarily. This approach reflected the realities of a world where every working hand mattered. Military service touched ordinary life as well. Farmers were called up seasonally. Supplies were requisitioned. Roads were maintained for armies as much as merchants. War was not distant. It interrupted planting, harvest, and trade, yet it was accepted as part of the system, regulated and expected rather than chaotic. Life in cities differed from life in villages, but not completely. Urban residents had greater access to markets, temples, and administration, but they were still subject to the same climate, shortages, and obligations. Cities did not escape the land. They adapted to it. What bound all of this together was memory. Records preserved obligations, rituals preserved order, tradition preserved identity. The empire functioned because people believed the system, though demanding, was predictable. When predictability failed, through famine, plague, or collapse, trust failed with it. The Hittite Empire was not held together by fear alone. It was held together by routines that worked, by farmers who planted despite uncertainty, by scribes who wrote despite repetition, by traders who moved despite risk. Kings ruled from capitals, but empire lived in villages. Power spoke in treaties, but survival whispered in fields. And it was this quiet, disciplined life, repeated thousands of times across Anatolia, that made the Hittite world real, durable, and for a time, unbreakable. The Hittites and Egypt, rivals at the edge of empire. The meeting of the Hittites and Egypt was not inevitable, but once it began, it could not be ignored. Two worlds shaped by different lands, different gods, and different ideas of power slowly moved toward one another, drawn by trade routes, contested territories, and the quiet pressure of empire. What followed was not simply a war, but one of the earliest examples of rivalry managed through diplomacy, memory, and law, a relationship that reshaped how great powers dealt with one another. For centuries, the Hittites had expanded outward from the Anatolian plateau, consolidating control over northern Syria and the regions that bridged the highlands of Anatolia with the warm river valleys of the south. These lands were valuable not only for their resources, but for their position. Whoever controlled them controlled movement, of armies, of merchants, of ideas. To the south stood ancient Egypt, a civilization shaped by the Nile, accustomed to abundance, ritual certainty, and a worldview in which the pharaoh stood at the centre of cosmic order. Egypt's power radiated northward through the Levant, sustained by garrisons, vassal cities, and long-established trade connections. For generations, Egyptian influence had reached deep into Syria. Between these two powers lay a zone of constant tension. Cities changed allegiance. Local rulers played one empire against the other. Loyalty was negotiated season by season, depending on which power seemed stronger, closer, or more reliable. This was not chaos, it was survival. The Hittites approached this contested world differently from Egypt. They did not see borderlands as permanent possessions to be dominated absolutely. They saw them as relationships to be managed. Treaties, hostages, marriages, and reciprocal obligations mattered as much as military force. Egypt, by contrast, framed power through dominance and divine kingship, with vassals expected to submit rather than negotiate. This difference would define their rivalry. The clash that history remembers most vividly is the Battle of Kadesh. Yet to understand it, one must first understand what Kadesh represented. The city sat near the Orontes River, controlling access between inland Syria and the Mediterranean coast. It was not merely a military prize, it was a symbol. To hold Kadesh was to claim authority over the northern Levant. For years, Kadesh had shifted between spheres of influence. Treaties were made and broken, garrisons were installed and expelled. Each empire watched the other carefully, aware that direct confrontation would be costly. Eventually, confrontation came. The battle occurred during the reign of Ramses II, one of Egypt's most ambitious rulers, and during the period when the Hittite state was consolidating its power in Syria. Both sides marched with confidence, each believing themselves favoured by gods and strategy alike. Egyptian sources describe Ramses advancing boldly, misled by false intelligence, believing the Hittite army was far away. In reality, the Hittites had concealed their forces carefully, using terrain, scouts, and timing. When the Hittite chariots struck, they did so with devastating coordination, exploiting Egyptian vulnerability. From a Hittite perspective, this was not reckless attack, but calculated pressure. Their chariots were heavier, their formations disciplined, their objective clear: to disrupt, not annihilate. The goal was to force negotiation, not destruction. The battle itself was chaotic. Chariots clashed. Infantry struggled to maintain cohesion. The outcome was uncertain. Egyptian texts portray Ramses as a lone hero, fighting against overwhelming odds and driving back the enemy through divine favour. Hittite records are quieter, but the result speaks clearly enough. Kadesh was not captured by Egypt, nor was the Hittite army destroyed. The battle ended without a decisive victor, and that mattered more than any heroic narrative. Both empires recognized the truth that the battlefield revealed. Neither could easily eliminate the other. Continued war would drain resources, destabilize borderlands, and invite rebellion. This realization marked a turning point. Instead of escalating conflict, the Hittites and Egypt began to formalize restraint. Diplomacy intensified. Messages crossed borders. Envoys negotiated terms. What emerged was unprecedented, a peace not enforced by conquest, but by agreement. The treaty that followed, often called the Treaty of Kadesh, stands as the earliest surviving international peace treaty known to history. It was not symbolic, it was detailed, reciprocal, and binding. Both sides agreed to respect borders, assist one another against internal rebellion, and recognize mutual legitimacy. The treaty was sworn before the gods of both nations. This mattered deeply. Divine witnesses transformed political agreement into cosmic obligation. To break the treaty was not merely to betray a rival, it was to invite divine punishment. For the Hittites, this approach was natural. Treaties had long been tools of governance. They were recorded, archived, and enforced through ritual. For Egypt, this marked a shift. Never before had Egypt acknowledged another power as an equal in such explicit terms. Marriage followed diplomacy. Royal unions linked the two courts, turning rivalry into kinship. A Hittite princess entered the Egyptian court, not as a captive, but as a partner. This act spoke louder than armies. It declared that balance, not domination, defined a new order. Behind this diplomatic success stood Hittite rulers who understood the limits of force. Kings such as Hattusili III recognized that empires survived not by constant war, but by managing relationships. Stability in Syria allowed resources to flow, rebellions to be contained, and legitimacy to be reinforced. The treaty also reveals how both civilizations understood fear. They feared not each other, but collapse. Internal unrest, rival powers, climate stress, and shifting trade routes threatened both empires. Cooperation was no longer idealistic, it was necessary. This relationship did not erase rivalry. Suspicion remained. Borders were watched. Intelligence was gathered. But the framework of diplomacy changed everything. Conflict became regulated. Violence became conditional. Memory replaced impulse. The legacy of this relationship extends far beyond the Bronze Age. The treaty introduced ideas that would define international relations for millennia. Mutual recognition, written agreements, divine or moral enforcement, and the understanding that peace could be as powerful as war. When the Hittite Empire eventually collapsed, Egypt survived longer, but the model endured. Later civilizations inherited the concept of treaty-bound diplomacy not from myth, but from clay tablets and stone inscriptions forged between these two powers. The meeting of the Hittites and Egypt was not the story of one defeating the other. It was the story of two empires recognizing their limits and choosing order over annihilation. At the edge of empire, rivalry became restraint. On the battlefield, equality was discovered. And from that discovery emerged a peace that history still remembers. Diplomacy, marriage, and the ancient world system. In the age of the Hittites, the world was not divided by clear borders or stable nations. It was a living web of relationships, fragile, negotiated, constantly under strain. Kingdoms rose not in isolation, but in awareness of one another. Every decision echoed outward. Every war risked pulling others into its wake. This was the ancient world system, long before the term existed, and the Hittites were among the first to truly understand how power survived inside it. From the stone halls and archives of Hattusa, messengers departed in every direction. Their clay tablets carried more than words. They carried recognition, reassurance, warning, and memory. The Hittite kings knew that an empire did not collapse only when armies failed. It collapsed when relationships failed. Diplomacy, therefore, was not an accessory to power. It was its foundation. The international landscape of the late Bronze Age was crowded and tense. To the south stood ancient Egypt, ancient, wealthy, and confident in a world view where the pharaoh embodied divine order. To the east, Assyria was rising, disciplined, aggressive, and increasingly intolerant of balance. To the west, Mycenaean powers exerted influence through trade, seafaring, and prestige rather than centralized empire. Between them lay a mosaic of smaller kingdoms, Ugarit, Kadesh, Aleppo, Mitanni, each essential, each vulnerable, each constantly renegotiating survival. This was not a world where dominance could be absolute. Any power that grew too strong risked coalitions forming against it. Any ruler who ignored balance invited collapse. The Hittites recognized this early. Rather than seeking to erase rivals, they sought to stabilize them. Rather than crushing neighbors, they bound them. Treaties were the primary tool of this strategy. Hittite treaties were not symbolic gestures. They were long, detailed documents that outlined obligations with almost obsessive care. Loyalty, Tribute, military support, extradition of fugitives, succession recognition, everything was specified. Even future scenarios were anticipated. What if a king died? What if rebellion occurred? What if a foreign power invaded? The treaty provided answers in advance. Crucially, these agreements were reciprocal. Even when the Hittites were clearly stronger, treaties framed relationships as mutual obligations rather than unilateral submission. This language mattered. It allowed vassals to maintain dignity. It allowed loyalty to feel rational rather than coerced. Stability followed. At the highest level, diplomacy revolved around recognition. Great kings addressed one another as brother. This single word carried enormous weight. To be called brother was to be acknowledged as an equal participant in the world order. To be denied it was a declaration of inferiority. Letters negotiated this status carefully, sometimes bitterly. Power was measured not only in soldiers but in how one was addressed. Correspondence was constant. Tablets crossed deserts and mountains, carried by trained envoys who understood that tone mattered as much as content. A delayed reply could be interpreted as insult. A poorly worded phrase could provoke suspicion. Diplomacy required discipline, patience, and emotional control. This was statecraft as performance. Gifts accompanied nearly every diplomatic exchange. Gold, silver, fine textiles, horses, chariots, precious stones. These were not luxuries. They were statements of capacity. A generous gift reassured allies that a kingdom was strong enough to share wealth. A modest gift could signal restraint or weakness. An imbalance in gift exchange could destabilize relationships just as surely as a military defeat. Marriage transformed diplomacy into kinship. Royal women were never exchanged casually. Each marriage was debated, negotiated, and recorded with care. When a Hittite princess was sent to a foreign court, she carried with her not only lineage, but expectation. She became a living treaty. Through her, two courts became family. Betrayal after marriage was no longer just political, it was personal. The marriage alliance between the Hittites and Egypt after decades of rivalry marked a profound shift in the ancient world. It was an admission that neither side could destroy the other without unravelling the system that sustained them both. Kinship replaced confrontation. Blood replaced the battlefield. Peace became permanent, not because it was ideal, but because it was necessary. Queens were central to this system. They were not silent figures. They wrote letters directly to foreign kings, negotiated disputes, and reminded allies of obligations when memories faded. Their authority often outlasted that of kings. In times of succession crisis, queens became anchors of continuity, preserving treaties while rulers changed. This mattered deeply. The ancient world feared disorder above all else. A broken succession could undo decades of diplomacy. Queens ensured that agreements survived death, ambition, and uncertainty. The Hittites also understood that smaller states mattered as much as great powers. Vassal kingdoms were not merely sources of tribute. They were buffers, connectors, and stabilizers. Local rulers retained their thrones, laws, and gods. In return, they provided loyalty, resources, and military support. This was not weakness. It was efficient governance. Rebellion was punished, but annihilation was avoided whenever possible. A destroyed city could no longer participate in trade, diplomacy, or defense. It weakened the entire network. Stability mattered more than spectacle. Religion reinforced every agreement. Treaties were sworn before gods shared across cultures: storm gods, sun gods, ancestral deities. These gods did not belong to one nation alone. They watched borders, they enforced oaths. To break a treaty was not merely political betrayal, it was cosmic crime, fear of divine punishment. gave treaties power beyond armies. This system also reveals a shared anxiety that haunted every court. Climate instability, famine, migration, internal rebellion. No kingdom was immune. Cooperation was not idealism, it was survival. Alliances were insurance against catastrophe. War still occurred, but it was structured. Conflict had rules. After battles came negotiations. Borders were adjusted, hostages exchanged, marriages arranged. Violence was a phase of diplomacy, not its opposite. Total destruction was rare because it destabilized everyone. The Hittites contributed something extraordinary to this world. They normalized the idea that peace could be written, archived, enforced, and remembered. That legitimacy came from recognition, not just conquest. That balance of power was not weakness, but wisdom. When the late Bronze Age collapse arrived, it shattered this system. Trade routes failed, communication broke down, cities burned, courts vanished, treaties lost meaning when the gods they invoked had no temples left to hear them. The web unravelled, yet the ideas endured. The belief that great powers could acknowledge one another as equals, that peace could be formal and binding, that marriage could stabilise borders, that balance mattered more than annihilation. These ideas would be rediscovered again and again, often mistaken for modern inventions. The Hittites did not merely rule territory, they helped govern a world. In an age balanced on memory, obligation and restraint, they understood a truth history would learn repeatedly. Power lasts longest when it is shared, recognised, and carefully maintained. Collapse in fire and silence. The end of the Hittite world. The end of the Hittite world did not arrive as a single moment etched cleanly into history. There was no final proclamation, no last triumphant enemy standing before the gates of Hattusa, no clear line where order ended and chaos began. Instead, the collapse unfolded like a slow unravelling of cloth, threads loosening one by one, unnoticed at first, until the entire fabric gave way. What followed was fire, abandonment, and a silence so complete that the Hittites themselves vanished from human memory for more than 3,000 years. For generations, the Hittite Empire had existed inside a carefully balanced world. It relied on predictable seasons, functioning trade routes, stable diplomacy, ritual continuity, and the belief that memory could preserve order. None of these elements failed at once. That is what made the collapse so devastating. Each failure weakened the others, until no part of the system could support the weight of the whole. The first signs were subtle enough to be dismissed. Seasons shifted. Rain came late or not at all. Snow lingered longer in the highlands. Harvests shrank by small but cumulative margins. In a land that had always lived close to scarcity, even minor disruption carried consequences. Granaries that once served as safeguards were emptied more often. Emergency reserves became routine necessities. Hunger did not announce itself dramatically. It crept. Climate stress alone would not have destroyed an empire, but it weakened the foundation. Farmers who struggled to feed families struggled to meet obligations. Taxes in grain fell short. Temple offerings diminished. Soldiers marched on thinner rations. The system continued, but under strain. At the same time, the arteries of the late Bronze Age world began to clog. Long-distance trade faltered. Tin, essential for bronze, weakened the entire military and economic structure when its flow slowed. Without reliable metal supply, weapons could not be replaced easily, tools wore down, infrastructure decayed. An empire that depended on coordination suddenly faced delay, shortage, and improvisation. Communication suffered next. Letters arrived late. Messengers failed to return. Allies grew distant, not from betrayal alone, but from their own crises. Vassal states questioned whether the Hittite king could still offer protection. Loyalty, once reinforced by stability, now required sacrifice without certainty. Rebellions flared not because subjects desired chaos, but because the old guarantees no longer held. Into this fragile world came movement. Entire populations shifted under pressure from drought, famine, and instability. Egyptian sources later called these movements the invasions of the Sea Peoples, but the reality was far less organised and far more desperate. These were not unified armies marching with banners. They were displaced communities, families, warriors, refugees pushing against borders that no longer held. The Hittite frontiers absorbed this pressure unevenly. Some cities resisted, others collapsed quickly. Garrisons were stretched thin, roads became unsafe, passes once controlled by treaties became corridors of chaos. An empire that relied on controlled movement now faced uncontrolled migration. Internally, authority weakened, succession disputes destabilized leadership, kings changed rapidly, and with each transition, continuity suffered. Treaties bound to one ruler lost clarity under the next. Ritual cycles were interrupted. When disasters struck, kings searched desperately for ritual explanations. Confession texts multiplied, recording failures, forgotten offerings, offended gods. The language of certainty gave way to anxiety. Religion, once the glue of order, became a source of fear. The gods were still honoured, but their silence grew unbearable. Storms did not obey prayers. Plagues spread. Omens contradicted one another, when the divine order failed to restore balance. Confidence in the human order collapsed alongside it. Hattusa felt these failures intensely. Maintaining a capital in the high Anatolian interior had always required effort. When supplies flowed, the city endured. When they faltered, isolation became a curse. Winters cut routes. Grain shipments failed. Administrative activity slowed. Archives that had once expanded relentlessly fell quiet. Fewer tablets were written. Fewer rituals recorded. Silence crept into rooms once filled with scribes and priests. The destruction of Hattusa itself was violent, but not glorious. Fires swept through districts. Buildings collapsed. Walls were breached or simply abandoned. There is no inscription celebrating a final defense, no heroic narrative carved into stone. The city was not conquered in a single climactic battle. It was emptied. Its people left. Its gods were no longer fed. What followed was unprecedented absence. Unlike other fallen empires, the Hittite state did not transform into a recognizable successor. There was no clear continuation of imperial authority. Smaller Neo-Hittite states emerged in parts of Syria and Anatolia, but they did not preserve the imperial centre. Writing disappeared from much of the plateau. Archives were not relocated. They were abandoned where they fell. Memory itself fractured. Ritual languages were forgotten. Laws were no longer copied. Treaties lost meaning when there were no courts left to enforce them. The world system the Hittites had helped maintain shattered completely. Trade networks collapsed. Diplomatic norms vanished. The balance of power gave way to fragmentation. For those who lived through the collapse, the experience must have been disorienting beyond measure. An order believed to be eternal dissolved within a lifetime. Kings failed. Gods seemed absent. Traditions no longer protected. The future, once managed through memory and ritual, became unknowable. Then came centuries of silence. Hattusa stood empty. Snow covered its walls. Grass grew through its streets. Travellers passed nearby without knowing its name. The Hittites faded so thoroughly that later civilizations remembered them only as distant adversaries mentioned briefly in Egyptian inscriptions. Even their language vanished from use. It was only in the modern era that the silence broke. Archaeologists uncovered clay tablets buried beneath ash and stone. Laws, prayers, treaties and confessions spoke again after 3,000 years. A forgotten empire returned. not through survival, but through recovery of memory. The collapse of the Hittite world was not caused by a single enemy or failure. It was systemic. Climate stress weakened agriculture. Trade breakdown weakened economies. Migration destabilized borders. Diplomacy failed without trust. Authority fractured without continuity. The very interconnectedness that once sustained the empire became the channel through which collapse spread. The Hittites did not fall because they were careless. They fell because they were part of a world too complex to save when its foundations cracked. Their end carries a quiet warning. Systems built on balance demand constant renewal. Memory cannot feed the hungry. Treaties cannot function without stability. Power cannot survive when connection becomes isolation. The Hittite world ended not with a final command, but with unanswered tablets. Not with a decisive battle, but with empty roads. Not with a loud fall, but with fire. And then an enduring silence that took millennia to hear again. Echoes of a forgotten superpower. The Hittite Empire did not end with a final proclamation, a remembered king, or a surviving people who carried its name forward. It ended in absence. And yet, absence did not mean erasure. Long after the fires died in Hattusa, long after the last rituals were spoken and the last tablets pressed into clay, echoes of the Hittite world continued to move quietly through history, unrecognized, unnamed, but enduring. The most remarkable thing about the Hittites is not that they collapsed. Many empires did. It is that they disappeared so completely that for thousands of years no one knew who they had been. Their cities lay silent across central Anatolia. Their language was unreadable, their gods unnamed, their laws unknown. Later civilizations walked past their ruins without understanding what they were seeing. Even the Greeks, who recorded so much of the ancient world, knew almost nothing of them. In Egyptian inscriptions, the Hittites survived only as key, distant rivals. Powerful, yes, but vague, flattened into the role of the enemy. This silence lasted more than 3 millennia, and yet the Hittites were never truly gone. Their influence persisted in fragments, carried forward by others who inherited pieces of their world without remembering its source. The successor states of Syria and southern Anatolia, often called Neo-Hittite kingdoms, kept alive aspects of Hittite culture, religion, and political practice. Storm gods continued to be worshipped under new names. Royal titles echoed older formulas. Ritual spaces were reused. Memory survived, but without context. Law, too, endured quietly. The Hittite emphasis on compensation, proportion, and restoration, rather than pure retribution, resurfaced in later legal traditions across the Near East. These ideas did not move as texts labelled Hittite law. They moved as habits, ways of thinking about justice shaped by scarcity, balance, and survival. Diplomacy carried even further echoes. The Hittite practice of written reciprocal treaties, binding rulers, successors, and gods alike, set a precedent that would shape international relations long after the empire vanished. The concept that peace could be formalized, archived, and enforced did not disappear with Hattusa. It re-emerged again and again, often treated as innovation, rarely recognized as inheritance. Even the idea of balance of power, the belief that stability depends on restraint rather than domination, finds one of its earliest clear expressions in the Hittite world. They understood that annihilating rivals invited collapse, while managing rivals created endurance. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly throughout history, often after catastrophic failure. For centuries, however, none of this was known consciously. The Hittites existed only as shadows. The rediscovery began quietly in the 19th century, when travellers and scholars encountered strange ruins in central Anatolia. Vast walls, carved gates, and abandoned sanctuaries that did not match known civilizations. Excavations at Boaz-Karlo revealed something extraordinary. Thousands of clay tablets buried beneath collapsed buildings, preserved by fire and time. At first, no one could read them. Then came the breakthrough. Scholars deciphered the script and realized that these tablets were written in an Indo-European language, one of the oldest ever recorded. Suddenly, voices long silent began to speak again. Laws, treaties, prayers, royal decrees, confessions, myths, all emerged from the earth, intact and astonishingly detailed. The Hittites returned to history not as myth but as people. What scholars found challenged assumptions. This was not a brutal, simplistic empire. It was literate, legalistic, diplomatic, and deeply self-reflective. Kings confessed errors, laws favoured restitution, treaties recognised equality, queens wielded authority, gods were negotiated with rather than blindly obeyed. The Hittites did not see themselves as masters of the world. They saw themselves as caretakers of order. Their archives revealed a civilization obsessed with memory. They copied older texts, even when they no longer fully understood them. They preserved foreign myths alongside native ones. They recorded failures as carefully as successes. This was not vanity, it was survival. In a world where forgetting invited chaos, memory was power. The rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya still stands as one of the clearest expressions of this worldview. Gods carved into living stone march in eternal procession, frozen in balance. The king stands among them, not as equal, but as participant. Power here is relational, not absolute. Modern archaeology transformed the Hittites from footnotes into central figures of the Bronze Age. They were no longer just Egypt's rival. They were architects of systems, legal, diplomatic, religious, that shaped the ancient world. And yet even now, the Hittites remain less famous than civilizations they rivaled or surpassed. They built no pyramids to dominate the skyline. They left no epic poems glorifying conquest. Their monuments were practical, their power was quiet, their legacy subtle. This may be why they disappeared so completely, and why their rediscovery feels so unsettling. The Hittites challenged modern assumptions about empire. They showed that power does not need spectacle to endure. That law can restrain kings. That diplomacy can rival warfare. That memory can be more dangerous than ambition. That collapse does not erase influence. In an age defined by interconnected systems, trade, climate, diplomacy, their story feels uncomfortably familiar. The same networks that sustained them carried collapse when balance failed. Their world ended not because they ignored complexity, but because complexity exceeded control. And yet, their ideas survived. Every written treaty that binds equals. Every legal system that favours restoration over destruction. Every diplomacy that seeks balance instead of annihilation. Every recognition that power must be remembered to be restrained. These are echoes of the Hittite world. The stones of Hattusa still stand in silence, but they are no longer forgotten. The tablets still speak. The gods still march across rock. The empire that vanished without heirs has returned as a lesson. Not all superpowers leave monuments that dominate memory. Some leave systems that outlive their names. And in that quiet endurance the Hittites remain, not as rulers of land, but as architects of how power itself is remembered. Empires do not always vanish in thunder. Some fade quietly, leaving laws, treaties, and shadows behind stone walls. The Hittites disappeared from memory, but the world they shaped never truly did.